She was 17 years old, and everything she owned in the world fit into a canvas satchel that did not need to be filled all the way to close. $30, counted out in a dry ledger voice, coin by coin, across a kitchen table she had eaten breakfast at for 2 years, without once being asked if she was hungry. That was the sum total of what remained to her, not because anyone hated her, but because a column of numbers had been added up, and $30 was what was left after the debts of a dead man were subtracted from his daughter's future. She would walk out of that house on a Tuesday morning in September, in the year 1879, with a bedroll under one arm and a brass compass in her coat pocket, its sighting arm engraved with 2 initials that were not her own, but had once belonged to the man who taught her to read the land, the way other girls were taught to read scripture. Settle in. Stay close. Wherever you are watching this from, tell us, so we know how far this story has traveled to reach you, because what she would find beneath a burned homestead, in a settlement everyone called worthless, was not treasure in the way treasure is usually meant. It was something quieter than that, and stranger, and it would take her most of a winter to understand what her father had actually left her. But that comes later. Right now, she is only a girl standing on a porch that is no longer hers, in a town called Rimrock Junction, watching a woman she has called Aunt for 2 years fold a ledger closed with the same care she might fold a good tablecloth after Sunday dinner, no more, no less. The sky above the junction that morning was the pale, scoured blue that Red Rock country wears in early autumn, before the heat breaks and before the cold sets in, and the wind carried grit from the wash behind the livery, the way it always did, so that everything in that town, the porch boards, the woman's black dress, the girl's own hands, seemed permanently dusted with the same fine reddish powder, as if the whole place had been sifted through a sieve and never quite settled. She had $30. She had a satchel, a bedroll, and a compass. She did not have a father, had not had one for 2 years, and she did not have, as of that morning, a home. What she had, though she did not yet know to count it as an inheritance, was patience, and an eye trained since the age of 8 to see what other people walked past without noticing: elevation in a slope, water in a dry-looking wash, the shape of a boundary line no one else could read. She would need all of it, every bit of it, and soon. But to understand what she carried in that compass, and why it mattered more than the $30 ever could, you have to go back further, back to a smaller version of her, sitting cross-legged on red dirt beside a man who never once raised his voice teaching her anything. She was 8 years old that spring, and the dirt beneath her was still cool from the night before, and the man beside her smelled of tobacco and boot oil and the particular sun-baked canvas of a survey satchel that had not been washed in a decade. He held the compass flat on his palm, the way another man might hold a bird he did not want to startle. He told her the needle was not magic. He told her it was only telling the truth about a thing most people never bothered to ask a question of. That distinction between magic and attention was the first lesson, though she would not understand for years that it was a lesson at all. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, not once in all the mornings that followed, not when she sighted the transit crooked, not when she misread a chain length and cost him an hour of retracing. He would only say, again, slower, and she would try again. That was the whole of his teaching method, again, slower, repeated across 4 years of red mornings and white afternoons, until the repetition itself became a kind of comfort, a sound as steady as the tick of the compass needle settling into north. He taught her to read a slope the way other fathers taught daughters to read scripture. He taught her that elevation was a story the land told about water, where it had been, where it wanted to go again given half a chance. He taught her that a dry wash was a liar with a memory, that it would fill again someday because it always had, and that the men who built towns without asking the wash what it remembered were the same men who lost those towns to a single September storm. She did not know then that he was teaching her a trade. She thought he was simply teaching her his habits, his patience, the particular tilt of his hat brim against the glare. She would sit beside him on a folded blanket, with a tin cup of water going warm in the sun, watching his hands work the vernier scale with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once in his life been in a hurry, and she would think this was simply what a childhood was. It was not until much later, years later, standing in ash up to her ankles, that she would understand the difference between a man who gave his daughter affection and a man who gave his daughter a profession, disguised so carefully as affection that she never felt the weight of it landing. He had been doing both at once, all along, in the same unhurried voice, on the same red ground, with the same brass compass passing back and forth between his hands and hers, like something being rehearsed for a day neither of them could yet name. That morning came sooner than either of them expected. She was 8 years old when the lesson stopped being a game and became something closer to a ritual, though neither of them would have used that word. He began each morning the same way, setting the transit on its tripod with the same 3 motions, checking the bubble in its little glass vial with the same tilt of his head, and only then would he call her over, never before, as though the instrument itself required a kind of order before it could be trusted to teach anything. He showed her how to sight along the crosshairs to a stake driven into red dirt 100 yards off, how to read the vertical arc for elevation, how to write the numbers down in a hand small enough to fit a whole survey day onto one page of a notebook bound in oilcloth. He made her repeat the chain measurements until her arms ached from the iron links, 66 feet at a time, counting under her breath the way other children counted jump rope rhymes. He never told her she was clever. He only nodded, once, when she got a bearing right, and that single nod carried more weight in her chest than any amount of praise might have. The summer she turned 10, a flash flood took out a stretch of survey stakes along a wash near Coldwater Flat, and he brought her along to help reset them, saying only that a man ought not do alone what a girl could help him do faster. She did not know until years afterward that no other surveyor in the territory brought a daughter into the field at all, that the other men in town spoke of it behind closed store doors as a peculiarity, sometimes with a laugh not quite kind. She did not know because he never let her see it land on him. He simply kept bringing her, kept handing her the compass to hold steady while he checked his notes, kept saying, in that same unhurried voice, that a line was only true if you were patient enough to walk it twice. The compass itself she had held before she could properly read the numbers stamped along its housing, and it was already old by then, its brass worn smooth at the edges, where 3 sets of hands before his had carried it through other men's surveys in other territories. He told her once, not making much of it, that it had belonged to his own father, and that someday the TW scratched into the underside of the sighting arm would mean something different to her than it did to him, though he did not say what, and she did not think to ask. She only remembers that he closed her hand around it that day, the way he closed the lid of the notebook each evening, gently, and with the air of a man setting something down for safekeeping until morning. Mornings, before the heat came up off the flats like something breathing, he would wake her while the sky still held its gray, and they would walk out past the corral fence to where the ground opened into long red distances, and he would set the tripod legs into the dirt with 3 quick strikes of his boot heel, always the same 3, always in the same rhythm, so that she came to know his mood by whether he struck harder or softer that morning. He taught her the chain first, the 100-foot length of iron links that had to be pulled taut and level, and he showed her how a slope could lie to you, how the eye wanted to believe flat ground was flatter than it was, and that this wanting was the first thing a surveyor had to put away. He made her walk the same 50 yards 4 times before he trusted her count, and when she finally matched his number to the half-link, he did not praise her outright. He only nodded once, the way he nodded at weather he approved of, and said that now she could be trusted with numbers, that men would build fences and dig wells by, and that this was no small thing to be trusted with. She did not understand yet what it cost him to teach a girl these things in a country that expected nothing of her but marriage and mending, and if the other surveyors thought it strange to see her crouched over his notebook with a pencil stub, marking elevations in her careful, childish hand, they said nothing to her directly, only exchanged glances she was too young to read as anything but curiosity. He never explained himself to them, and he never explained himself to her either. He simply continued, morning after morning, as though the work itself were the explanation, as though patience needed no defense. By the time she was 11, she could sight a line through the transit and call the reading before he checked it, and by 12, she had learned to read the faint pencil notations he made in the margins of his field book, the small private shorthand of a man used to being alone with his own observations. He let her keep a page near the back for her own marks. Nothing important, just practice figures and the occasional sketch of a hawk circling above the canyon rim, and he never once told her to stop, though paper was not cheap, and neither was time. It was in that same book, years later, that she would find the notation dated the spring before he died, written in a hand grown careless with fatigue, marking a spring-fed parcel north of the settlement that he had surveyed but never filed. Though that discovery belonged to a colder season still ahead of her, one she could not yet imagine on those warm red mornings when his shadow and hers fell long and equal across the measured ground. The compass came to her the winter she turned 13, and there was no ceremony to it, no speech about legacy or lineage, only her father setting it in her palm one evening after supper and closing her fingers over it the way a man closes a gate he trusts will hold. He had carried it since before her mother died, since before Sarah herself had been born, brass gone dark at the edges from handling, the sighting arm engraved underneath with his initials in letters so small she had to tilt it to the lamplight to find them the first time he showed her. He told her a compass was only honest if the man reading it was honest first, that the needle would tell the truth, but a careless hand would misreport it, and that the two failures looked the same on paper, though they were not the same at all. She did not fully understand him then. She turned the words over for years afterward, the way she turned the compass itself, worrying at the meaning, the way weather worries at brass, until it wore down to something she could hold without effort. She carried it everywhere after that, in the deep pocket of her apron when she helped at the house, in her satchel when they rode out to the section lines, under her pillow on the nights her father stayed late in town settling accounts with men who owed him money for surveys they no longer wished to pay for. She learned to feel for its weight, the way another girl might feel for a locket, though it held no portrait, no lock of hair, nothing sentimental in the ordinary sense, only true north, patiently given, and the small worn letters that meant her father's hand had shaped this exact piece of brass into an instrument of his own particular honesty. By 14, she could set a transit without his direction, could call elevation off a rod held steady by a hired hand twice her age, could close a survey loop within inches, and know, before he told her, whether the error was hers or the chain's. He began to speak less on their outings, not from distance, but from a kind of quiet satisfaction he did not put into words, content to watch her work, the way a man watches a fire he built burn steady on its own. The desert around them that spring was unusually green after a wet winter. The red rock softened at its base with grass that would not last past June, and she remembered thinking, without knowing why the thought mattered, that she should notice it now because it would not stay this way. She did not know yet how little time remained between that season and the ledge above the canyon where his boot would find loose shale instead of stone. She only knew the compass was warm in her hand, and that the ground ahead of them, freshly measured, seemed for once entirely solid. The fall came in April, on a Tuesday, though she would not think of that detail's cruelty until much later, when another Tuesday came to take something else from her, in a different way entirely. He had gone up alone to check a boundary marker above a narrow canyon 2 miles east of their camp, a routine climb he had made perhaps 30 times before, the kind of errand that did not require her presence. And so she had stayed below with the mule and the ledger, recording notes he would dictate to her when he came down. She heard nothing that alarmed her at first, no cry, no sound at all that distinguished itself from the ordinary settling of rock that the canyon produced all day in the heat. It was the silence afterward that told her something, a silence with a different shape than the one before it, though she could not have explained the difference to anyone who asked her later, and several people did ask, gently, as if the answer might matter to them the way it mattered to her. She found him at the base of the ledge with the transit still strapped across his back, unbroken, the brass fittings catching what light came down into that narrow place, and she noted even then, in the part of her mind he had trained to notice things regardless of what else was happening, that the instrument had survived the fall better than he had. She did not remember walking the 2 miles back for help. She remembered only that the compass was in his coat pocket and that she took it before anyone else arrived, not from any calculation, but from something older than calculation, and that no one who came afterward, Not the two ranch hands who carried him down, not the man from Rimrock Junction who came with a wagon 2 days later, ever asked her why she had it, or thought to take it from her. She was 15 that spring, and the desert did not pause for her the way people sometimes imagine it should. The grass that had come up green after the wet winter burned brown on schedule in June, exactly as it always had, exactly as he had told her it would. She buried him in a plot behind the church at Rimrock Junction, in ground he had surveyed himself years before for a rancher who never paid him for the work, and she stood at the edge of it in a borrowed black dress that did not fit her, holding the compass in both hands, as though it might otherwise be taken from her by the wind. And she did not cry where anyone could see her, because he had taught her, without ever saying so directly, that a person's grief was hers to spend as carefully as her money, and not to be handed out for free to whoever happened to be standing near. After the burial, she went back to her aunt's house on Cedar Street, the one with the green shutters and the porch that faced east, so the morning heat came in before the coffee did, and she stayed there for 2 years, the way a piece of furniture stays somewhere it was never quite bought for. Her aunt fed her, clothed her, corrected her posture at the table, and kept a ledger of it all in a small book with a marbled cover, entries in a tight, upright hand that never varied whether the sum was for shoe leather or a doctor's visit the winter she took the grip. She was not unkind. She simply believed that kindness and accounting were the same thing, and that a debt acknowledged was a debt already half paid, and she said as much once, standing at the stove with her back turned, as though the words cost her nothing to say, and should cost the girl nothing to hear. The girl worked. She did not ask to work. It was simply understood, the way the sun rising was understood, that a 17-year-old girl living under a roof not her own would earn the space she occupied. She mended nets for a neighbor who ran a small trapline west of town, kept accounts for the dry goods store 2 afternoons a week, in a hand her father had taught her. Straight columns, no smudging, figures checked twice before the ink dried, and in the evenings, when the house had gone quiet and her aunt had retired with her marbled book and her spectacles, she took the compass from its cloth wrapping and turned it over in her hands, tracing the 2 letters on the underside of the sighting arm with her thumb until the brass there had gone slightly brighter than the rest, worn smooth by nothing but that repeated, private attention. She did not speak of her father often, not because the town had forgotten him. Men still mentioned his surveys when they argued over fence lines, still cited his elevation marks as though they were scripture, but because speaking of him aloud in that house felt like handing something over that was not asked for and would not be returned in kind. She kept the field notes he had left her in a tin box under her cot, not the sealed one buried 100 miles west beneath ash and stone, but a smaller one, ordinary, holding a handful of loose pages in his handwriting, diagrams of triangulation points and elevation differentials that meant nothing to anyone else in that house, and everything to her. She read them the way other girls her age read letters from suitors, slowly, by lamplight, moving her finger along the lines as though retracing his own hand moving across the paper. She turned 17 in the last week of August, 1879, and no one remarked on it particularly, and the days went on being counted out in her aunt's ledger the way they always had, until one Tuesday morning in September, when her aunt asked her to sit down at the kitchen table, and reached, without any particular change in her expression, for the marbled book. The book was bound in marbled paper gone soft at the corners from handling, and she had seen it perhaps a dozen times in 2 years, always at the table, always in daylight, as though her aunt considered ledgers unsuited to lamplight, the way some considered cards unsuited to Sunday. It smelled of the ink her aunt mixed herself from powder and water in a small brown jar, a smell Sarah had come to associate less with numbers than with endings, though she could not have said why, until that particular morning made the association permanent. Her aunt opened the book to a page already marked with a thin strip of ribbon, and turned it so that it faced Sarah rather than herself, which was a courtesy her aunt extended rarely, and only when she wished a thing to be understood without argument. The kitchen smelled of the coffee her aunt had made an hour before and not offered to share, and of the lye soap drying on the windowsill, and faintly of the dust that came in under the door no matter how often it was swept. Dust that had traveled, Sarah sometimes thought, all the way from the red country west of the mountains, though she knew this was fancy and not fact. Her aunt's hands were folded on the table beside the book, dry hands, ringless, the nails cut close and square, hands that had never once struck her and had never once, in 2 years, rested on her shoulder either. "There is a sum owed you," her aunt said, "from your father's estate, once the debts were settled against it." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way she might have read out a weather report, or the price of grain, a fact belonging to the world, rather than to the two of them sitting in it. Sarah watched her aunt's finger move down the column, past entries for burial costs and outstanding accounts at the feed store, and the doctor's final bill from the spring 2 years gone, entries written in the same careful hand that had once written out Sarah's chores for the week pinned to the icebox door, and she understood, watching that finger travel, that whatever number it stopped on had already been decided long before this morning, that the morning itself was only the formality required to make the decision visible. The finger stopped. Her aunt turned the book fully toward her, so that Sarah could read the figure herself, rather than take it second-hand, and there was something in that gesture, some strange, cold fairness, that Sarah would turn over in her mind many times in the years afterward, unable to decide whether it had been the kindest thing her aunt ever did for her, or the cruelest. The number was $30, written in ink that had not yet fully dried, as though her aunt had waited until the very morning to set it down, unwilling to commit to the figure even one day before it was needed. Beside it, in the same hand, a short accounting, the sum of her father's estate after the burial costs, the doctor's bill, the settling of the feed store account, and the small unpaid balance on a saddle he had ordered the winter before he died and never lived to collect. $30 was what remained when everything owed had been subtracted from everything left, and her aunt did not offer commentary on the figure, did not suggest it was generous or meager, only let it sit on the page the way a sum sits at the bottom of a column, indifferent to whoever must carry it away. She did not ask Sarah if the number seemed fair. She did not ask Sarah anything at all. She closed the ledger with both hands, the way she might close a hymnal at the end of a service, and set it back on the shelf beside the almanac and the seed catalog, in the exact space it had occupied every day of the 2 years Sarah had lived beneath that roof, and Sarah understood that the ledger would remain there long after she herself was gone from the house, that the room would close over her absence the way water closes over a dropped stone, smooth and unbothered within the hour. Her aunt rose from the table and went to the tin box on the mantel, the same box that had held egg money and mending thread and, once, a lock of her mother's hair that Sarah had never been permitted to touch. She counted the bills out slowly, not because she distrusted her own arithmetic, but because she believed, plainly, that a sum of money deserved to be counted in front of the person receiving it, so that no question of amount could ever arise between them later. $10, then 10 more, then 5, then 5 again, laid one atop another, on the table's worn oilcloth, and when she had finished, she did not push them toward Sarah, so much as simply stop touching them, leaving the bills to sit there as their own small, complete fact. "That settles the account," she said, and there was no more warmth or coldness in the sentence than there had been in any other she had spoken that morning. She did not say, "I am sorry," because she did not believe there was anything to apologize for, and she did not say, "Good luck," because luck was not a category she dealt in. She simply turned back toward the stove, where the coffee had begun to boil over, and left Sarah standing there with $30 in her hand, and the whole rest of the day, the whole rest of her life, waiting outside the door like weather she had not yet stepped into. She folded the bills once, lengthwise, the way she had seen her father fold receipts, before sliding them into his breast pocket, and she did not count them again, because Constance's counting had already made them a fact, and facts did not require a second inspection. She went up to the room that had been hers for 2 years, without ever quite becoming hers, and she rolled her bedroll tight, and she packed the canvas satchel with what little belonged to her outright: 2 dresses, a spare pair of stockings, a small tin of salve for cracked hands, her father's compass wrapped in a handkerchief at the very bottom, where her fingers could still find it without looking. She did not linger over the room. There was nothing in it that had ever asked her to stay. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of scorched coffee, and Constance was already occupied with the business of skimming the pot clean, her back turned in a way that was not unkindness so much as the simple fact that the morning had other tasks in it besides watching a girl leave. Sarah said she was going. Constance said she hoped the roads were dry. Neither of them said anything more than that, and Sarah found, stepping out onto the porch, that she had expected to feel something larger than she did. Grief, perhaps, or anger, some emotion sized to match the occasion, but what she felt instead was a kind of clean, quiet emptiness, the feeling of a room swept bare, waiting to be filled with whatever she chose to put into it. The town of Rimrock Junction looked the same as it had every morning of the 2 years she had lived in it, the same dust lifting off the same rutted street, the same tin-roofed feed store rattling faintly in the wind, the same church bell that never rang except on Sundays. And she understood, walking down its single street with her satchel over one shoulder and her bedroll under the other arm, that the town had never really known her, and would not particularly notice that she was gone. She stopped once at the Mercantile to ask after wagons heading southeast, toward the Red Rock country, and the clerk there, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained fingers, told her there was a freighter leaving that afternoon, bound past Coldwater Flat, hauling feed to the outlying ranches, and that he charged $2 a head for the ride if she didn't mind sitting up with the mules. She minded nothing that came with a fixed price and an honest answer. She paid the $2 from the folded bills in her pocket, watched the amount subtract itself cleanly from the sum Constance had counted, and sat on an overturned crate outside the feed store to wait, the compass a small, steady weight against her hip, the whole flat width of the afternoon stretching out ahead of her like a road she had not yet learned the grade of. The freighter came around the corner of the feed store at 2:15, a low wagon with high slat sides, and a team of 4 mules that regarded her with the flat disinterest of animals long past caring who climbed aboard. The driver was an older man named Hollis, gray-whiskered, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some accident he did not explain, and she did not ask after, and he told her to sit forward near the boards where the ride was smoothest, and to mind the feed sacks did not shift onto her legs when the road turned rough. She thanked him and climbed up, without waiting to be helped, setting her satchel between her feet and her bedroll across her knees, and when he clicked his tongue at the mules and the wagon groaned forward, she felt the whole town of Rimrock Junction drop away behind her, like something she had only borrowed for 2 years and was now returning, unclaimed, to whoever came after. The road ran southeast, through country that grew steadily more sparse the farther they traveled, the scattered ranch fences giving way to open range, and then to no fences at all, only the red rock rising in long broken shelves against a sky bleached pale with heat. Hollis talked little, which suited her, and what he did say was practical: the names of the ranches they passed, the condition of a washed-out culvert, a warning that the mules did not care for rattlesnakes and would let a person know about it plainly enough. She watched the land pass with the particular attention her father had trained into her without either of them calling it training, noting the grade of the road, the cut of an arroyo, the way certain rock formations repeated themselves like sentences in a language she was only now remembering how to read. By late afternoon, the shadows had lengthened until they ran the full width of the road, and Hollis pointed with his chin toward a low rise ahead where the ground flattened into a wide basin rimmed by red cliffs, and said that was Coldwater Flat, or what remained of it, and that he wasn't driving in past the turnoff, since his business lay with the Whitlock spread another 6 miles on. He set her down where a rutted spur trail broke off from the main road, took his $2 with a nod that carried no particular warmth or coldness, and rattled on without looking back. She stood alone on the spur trail with the sun beginning its long slide toward the western rim, her satchel over one shoulder, her bedroll under the other arm, and the compass a small, steady weight against her hip, and ahead of her, past a stand of dead cottonwoods, she could see the first broken rooftops of the town her father had once surveyed and never finished leaving. She walked toward the cottonwoods with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned not to hurry into unfamiliar ground, her father's voice returning to her unbidden, the way it always did when the light went low and gold like this. "Look before you step, girl. The land will tell you what it wants to hide. The dead trees stood in a ragged row, their bark peeled back in long silver strips, their branches bare against a sky gone the color of a bruise healing. Beyond them, the town opened up all at once, the way a wound opens when the bandage comes away faster than expected. There was less of it than she had imagined, and more. Perhaps a dozen structures remained standing in any recognizable form, their roofs sagging, their walls scoured pale by 6 years of wind and grit. A general store with its false front still bearing the ghost of painted letters she could not fully read from this distance. A row of what had been miners' shanties, roofless now, open to the sky like broken teeth. Somewhere a door swung on a single hinge, with a slow, patient creak that seemed to keep its own private time, independent of the wind, independent of her. She did not go toward the buildings first. She went toward the creek bed that cut along the eastern edge of the flat, dry now, its bottom cracked into a mosaic of pale plates, and she crouched at its edge and studied the banks the way her father had taught her to study banks, for the old water line, for the silt deposits, for the places where flood had reached and receded, and left its signature in the soil, like a signature on a page. The line was high, higher than she would have guessed. She thought of Hollis mentioning the flood almost as an afterthought, a footnote to the silver, and understood standing there that for whoever had lived through it, it had not been a footnote at all. The light was going amber now, catching the red rock of the cliffs and setting them faintly aglow, and she knew she had perhaps an hour before she needed shelter for the night. She turned from the creek bed and looked back across the flat, past the shanties, past the store, to where the ground rose slightly toward the northern edge of the basin, and there, half obscured by a stand of scrub brush that had grown up thick and unchecked, she saw what the fading light nearly kept from her, a stone chimney, standing alone, blackened at its base, with no walls left around it at all. She stood very still for a long moment, the compass warm now against her hip from the day's walking, and something in her chest tightened the way it did when she recognized a landmark from an old map before she had confirmed it with her own eyes. She did not run toward it, though something in her wanted to. She made herself walk the way her father had taught her to walk, a section line, steady, measured, counting without meaning to, as if her feet remembered chains and links, even when her mind was elsewhere. 40 paces, 60. The scrub brush caught at the hem of her skirt, and she did not stop to free it, only pulled through, and the chimney grew larger against the amber sky with every step, until she was standing at the edge of what had once been a room. The walls were gone entirely, burned down to a low, uneven line of foundation stone that traced a rectangle in the dirt, perhaps 16 feet by 20, and within that rectangle the ground was black and gray and strange, ash gone hard with years of rain and sun, until it had become almost like a second soil. The chimney itself rose maybe 8 feet, cracked along one side, a swallow's nest wedged into a gap near the top. She stood at what would have been the doorway and looked in, and it was the smell that struck her first, faint but unmistakable beneath the dust and creosote, old smoke, decades old, but smoke nonetheless, the kind that never entirely left a place once it had burned that deep. She stepped inside the foundation carefully, testing the ground with her boot, before setting her weight down, and crouched near the hearth. The hearthstone was a single wide slab, larger than the others, tilted now where the earth beneath it had settled unevenly, and she found herself looking at it the way she had once looked at elevation notes her father marked in his book, not idly, but with the particular attention of someone who has been taught that ground does not lie about what has happened to it, only waits to be asked correctly. She thought of the boarding houses Hollis had mentioned, the men who had come through with the survey crews before the strike, before the flood, before all of it. She thought of her father's notebook entries about a homestead near the northern rise, words she had read a dozen times on the ride out, without understanding what they meant, until now, standing over the very stones he must have once sat beside. The light was failing fast, the amber going to gray, and she knew she should be building her own fire before dark took the basin entirely. But she stayed a moment longer, one hand resting flat against the tilted hearthstone, feeling how loose it sat against the packed earth beneath it, how it rocked, almost imperceptibly, under the pressure of her palm. The rocking meant something. She had learned that, too. without knowing she had learned it, that stone set true does not move, that a hearthstone laid by a careful hand settles once and stays settled, and that anything shifting after 6 years of silence had either been disturbed by weather or by intention. She pressed again, harder this time, and felt the give travel down through her palm into her wrist, a small dishonest looseness where there should have been none. She glanced toward the darkening rise, toward the place where her satchel and bedroll waited unattended, and told herself she would only look, that looking cost nothing, that the dark could wait the length of one more breath. She worked her fingers beneath the stone's lower edge, where ash had packed itself into the seam like mortar, and pried, until it lifted a half-inch, then an inch, grit hissing free in a thin gray stream. The stone was heavier than it looked, cold on its underside despite the day's heat, and when she finally tipped it back onto the ground beside its socket, the sound it made was flat and final, like a door closing rather than opening. Beneath it lay not the packed clay she expected, but a shallow hollow, deliberate in its shape, too square-cornered to be anything the earth had made on its own. She knelt without deciding to kneel. Her knees found the ash, and did not mind it. The last light came sideways now, low and orange, catching the hollow's edge and throwing a shadow across whatever sat inside it, so that for a moment she could see only shape and not substance. A rectangle, dark, its corners softened by rust or dirt or both. She reached in anyway, the way her father had taught her to reach into a survey stake hole when she was young and afraid of scorpions, slow and flat-palmed, feeling before grasping. Her fingers met metal, cold and pitted, seams gone rough with corrosion, a lid that resisted her touch with the stubbornness of something that had not been opened in longer than she had been alive. She did not lift it yet. She only rested her hand there, the way she had rested it on the hearthstone a moment before, feeling the shape of it under her fingers. A box, iron by the weight already telegraphing itself through her wrist. Its lid seemed shut with rust, the color of dried blood, sitting exactly where someone had meant it to be found, or exactly where someone had meant it never to be found again. The wind moved through the broken doorway behind her, stirring ash into a thin gray spiral, and somewhere beyond the ruined walls, a nighthawk called once and went silent, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at the edge of dark, that whatever this was, she would not be able to leave it buried until morning. She worked her fingers along the seam, the way her father had shown her to work a stuck drawer in a survey chest, not forcing it, but finding where the resistance was least, and pressing her patience there instead of her strength. The rust gave in flakes, dry and reddish, sifting onto the backs of her hands like a fine, bitter snow. She dug with her fingers first, widening the hole around the box's edges, and only when she had cleared enough space did she reach for the small trowel she carried, for loosening hard ground, sliding it beneath the lip of the lid with the same care she had once watched him use to lift a fossil from shale without cracking it. The lid did not open so much as surrender, all at once, with a small tearing sound as the last of the rust broke free, and a smell rose out of the box that she had not expected. Dry paper, old oil, something like the inside of her father's saddlebag, after years of folded maps and tallow-rubbed leather. She sat back on her heels. The last light was nearly gone now, the canyon rim burning down to a thin orange line, and she understood she would need to work by feel and by memory more than by sight. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, she could make out the shape of papers, bound flat, and beneath them something harder, a small bundle, tied with what felt like waxed cord. She did not unwrap them there in the dark with the wind picking up and the ash still stirring behind her. She lifted the whole bundle free, cradling it against her chest, the way she might have carried water across uneven ground, careful not to spill what she did not yet understand. She carried it back toward her small fire, which had burned down to embers while she worked, and knelt beside it, feeding it a few dry sticks until the light strengthened enough to see by. Her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady, though the night was not cold. She set the bundle on a flat stone near the flame and looked at it a long moment before touching the cord, the way her father had once told her to look a long moment at a stake before pulling it, in case the ground around it told her something the stake itself could not. Somewhere out past the broken chimney, The nighthawk called again, farther off this time, and the wind carried the smell of char and sage and the mineral coldness that comes off red rock after dark. She untied the first knot. Her fingers remembered, without her telling them to, the particular slowness her father used for anything that mattered. The same slowness he had used teaching her to read a chain, to log an elevation, to trust a number only after checking it twice. She loosened the second knot. The oilcloth fell open in her lap, and by the small orange light of the fire, she saw her father's handwriting for the first time in 2 years. The pages were smaller than she remembered field notebooks being, bound in a cover of oiled brown leather gone stiff and dark at the corners, and the first thing she saw was not words at all, but a column of numbers, ruled with a straight edge, each figure written in the same careful, upright hand he had used to teach her the shape of every digit before he let her touch a chain herself. She had forgotten, in 2 years, how small his numbers were, how he crowded them close together on the page as though paper itself cost something dear, though she knew now it was habit from lean seasons, not want in that particular year. She turned the first leaf slowly, the way one turns a leaf that might crumble, though the paper had kept remarkably well inside the tin and the oilcloth, dry as the desert around her, and on the second page she found a sketch of a slope, drawn in his patient cross-hatching, with a line of elevations running down one margin and a notation beside it she recognized at once. Spring, year-round, confirmed twice. She sat very still. Confirmed twice. Not once. Guessed at, hoped for. Twice. Checked against itself. The way he had taught her every important number must be checked, because a single reading could lie to a man, but 2 readings rarely agreed to lie the same way. She read the words again by the firelight, moving her lips without sound, and felt something rise in her chest that she did not yet have a name for, something between grief and recognition, as though she had opened a door, expecting an empty room, and found her father sitting inside it, unmoved by the years, waiting with his hat in his lap. She turned another page, and here the notation shifted from slope and spring to boundary. A run of courses and distances, chain lengths noted in his small figures, corners marked with the particular symbols he had drilled into her on the kitchen table in Rimrock Junction using a pencil stub and a scrap of butcher paper, back when she was 8 years old and thought a compass was only a toy that pointed north. She traced one course with her finger without meaning to, the way she might have traced it aloud for him once, checking his arithmetic the way he'd let her check it even as a child, correcting her only when she was wrong, and never when she guessed right by accident. Beneath the survey pages lay a folded sheet, thinner than the rest, its creases gone soft and pale with handling long before the fire had ever touched this ground. She did not open it yet. She only looked at it, the way she had been taught to look at a steak before pulling it, and let the fire pop once in the quiet, and listen to her own breathing slow to match the small movements of her hands. She unfolded it the way he had taught her to unfold anything that mattered, corner first, then the opposite corner, never dragging a crease flat with a thumbnail, because paper remembered how it had been folded and would tear along a new line faster than an old one. The hand was his. She had known it would be, and still the sight of it struck her somewhere beneath the ribs. That particular slant he gave his capital letters, the way his T leaned forward like a man walking into wind. He had written her name at the top, not the diminutive he used at the supper table, but her full given name, the one he used only on documents, as though he had known this paper would need to stand as something official, something that could be read by strangers in a land office, and not only by a daughter across a kitchen table. The letter was short. He had never been a man of long sentences, not on paper, not in speech, and she had loved him for that economy without ever naming it as a thing to love. He wrote that the parcel he had surveyed above the wash carried a spring that ran the year through, that he had checked it in the dry months of 2 separate summers to be certain, and that he had intended to file on it once she was old enough to hold the land herself, rather than have it held for her by some court-appointed stranger who had never walked the ground. He wrote that he had not filed sooner because a man ought to be sure of a thing before he put his name to it in ink that could not be scratched out, and that he had meant to be sure, and had run out of time before he finished being sure. She read it twice. The second time she did not read the words so much as listen to them, the way she used to listen to him read aloud from the almanac on winter evenings, half for the information and half for the sound of him saying anything at all. The fire had burned low while she read, down to a bed of orange coals that gave more heat than light now, and she became aware of the cold at her back for the first time since she had knelt at the hearthstone that afternoon. She folded the letter along its old creases, corner to corner, and set it apart from the other pages, and she sat for a while longer, with the box open on her knees and the notebook closed beside it, not moving to build the fire back up, not moving to eat the last of the bread in her satchel, only sitting with the two things her father had left folded inside the earth for 6 years, the survey that named the land and the letter that named her, and understanding, slowly, the way understanding comes to a person kneeling rather than standing, that a claim unfiled was not the same as a claim abandoned. She built the fire back up after all, because the cold had a way of settling into the joints that made the hand unsteady, and she would need a steady hand for what came next. She took the notebook onto her lap again and turned to the elevation sketches near the back, the ones she had passed over quickly the first time, in her hurry to reach the letter, and now she studied them the way he had taught her to study anything that mattered, not once, but 3 times, each pass looking for something different. The first pass for the shape of the land, the second pass for the numbers, the third pass for what the numbers meant when you set them beside the shape. The parcel he had drawn ran along the dry wash below the burned homestead and climbed gently to the northeast, 70 acres by his chain count, bounded on one side by a stand of cottonwood that marked the spring, and on the other by a ridgeline he had noted only as rock, no value, do not survey past this point. A line she recognized now as the same ridge she had crossed that morning without knowing it carried meaning. He had set his markers with the same careful hand he used for everything, iron pins driven at each corner, their positions recorded not just by chain and compass bearing, but by triangulation from 2 fixed points on the canyon wall, so that even if a pin were lost or buried, the corner could be found again by any surveyor who knew how to read the notation. She had watched him do this 100 times on smaller jobs, string held taut between her small hands while he called out figures for her to write, and she understood now, sitting alone with his box open on her knees, that he had not merely surveyed this land. He had made it so that it could never be entirely lost, not to fire, not to flood, not to 6 years of silence, because the proof of it lived on paper as much as it lived on the ground. The claim form itself was a different matter, brittle, where the ink had dried unevenly, dated in his hand at the top. Coldwater Flat, Township Survey, Section 14, and blank where his signature should have closed it. She turned it over once, twice, looking for some later mark, some sign he had meant to finish it, and simply run out of time, and found nothing but the blank line, waiting the way it had waited for 6 years. Patient in a way paper should not have been able to be. She set it down carefully on the hearthstone beside her, waited with a piece of broken brick so the draft would not take it, and she sat looking at the space where his name was supposed to go, turning over in her mind not whether the land was worth having, but whether she had any right to finish what he had started and never signed. The letter was the last thing she lifted from the box, and it was shorter than she expected a man's last words to be, as though he had known that long sentences were a luxury he could not promise himself. It was dated the autumn before he died, written in the same hand that had filled the notebook's margins for years, only slower now, the letters leaning a little more than they used to, as if his wrist had already begun to tire of the work he loved. He did not write of fear. He wrote of the spring, how it ran clear even in August when every other seep in the flat had gone to mud, how he had walked the boundary 3 times to be certain of the corners before he trusted them enough to put them on paper. He wrote that he was holding the claim until she was old enough to understand what it meant to hold ground, not just to stand on it. He wrote that a survey was a kind of promise a man made to a piece of land, and that he intended this one particular promise for her alone, when she was ready to keep it herself. She read it through once quickly, the way a person reads bad news, bracing for the worst of it before the meaning can settle. Then she read it again slowly, in the failing light, with the wind working at the canvas above her, and the ash cold under her knees. And this time, She let herself hear it, the way he must have meant it, not as an apology for dying before he finished, but as an instruction left for a version of her he could not know yet, a 17-year-old sitting alone in a burned house with his tools in her lap. He had not been guessing at her future. He had been building toward it, quietly, the way he built every survey, one marker at a time, trusting the corners even when no one else could see the shape they made. She folded the letter along its old crease and set it with the notebook and the claim form, the 3 papers laid edge to edge on the hearthstone, like instruments on a bench, each one useless without the others, each one true only in relation to what surrounded it, much the way he had taught her a single measurement meant nothing until it was tied into the whole. The fire had gone to coals. Somewhere beyond the canvas the wind shifted, carrying the dry mineral smell of the flat, and she sat there a long while, not moving, doing the only kind of arithmetic that mattered now, not what the land was worth, but what it would cost her to claim it in her own name. The cost, she decided, was not measured in dollars, though dollars would enter into it soon enough. It was measured in the distance between sitting quietly with a claim and standing up to press it. Her father had taught her that a boundary line meant nothing until someone walked it, drove stakes into it, swore to it before a witness who could be trusted to remember. He had done the walking, he had done the driving, he had died before the swearing, and that last piece, small as it sounded, was the piece that turned a notebook full of numbers into 70 acres of ground, with her name attached to it. She thought of the rancher whose cattle she had seen grazing the flat on her way in, unhurried animals moving over grass that grew thick near a spring no one else had bothered to ask about. He had not filed on it because no one had made him. That was not malice. That was only the shape indifference takes when it goes unchallenged long enough. The same shape, she realized, that had let her aunt hand her $30 across a ledger and call the matter closed. Neither of them had done anything so simple as cruelty. They had only assumed no one was watching closely enough to object. She was watching now. She gathered the papers into her father's oilcloth wrap, tied it with the same worn cord he had always used, and set it inside her satchel beside the compass, so that heirloom and evidence traveled together the way instrument and measurement always had in his hands. Outside, the light had gone the color of weak tea, the sun dropping toward the far rimrock, and the burned house stood behind her, holding its silence, the way it had held it for 6 years, patient, unbothered, waiting to see what she would do with what it had kept. She did not know yet how a claim was properly filed, what forms a county recorder required, what proof beyond a dead man's notebook a clerk might demand before he would take a girl's word over a rancher's years of quiet use. She knew only that somewhere south, in the county seat, there would be an office, a ledger of another kind entirely, and a man behind a counter who could tell her whether her father's markers still held any weight in the eyes of the law. She banked what remained of the fire, rolled her bedroll, and stepped out past the chimney into the cooling air, the flat stretching gray and wide before her, the spring, somewhere out there still running exactly where her father had marked it, patient as everything else in this country that had learned to wait. The county seat sat 2 days southward by wagon, and she covered the distance the way her father had taught her to cover any distance, steadily, without waste, watching the ground for what it could tell her. The road ran through country she did not know, past ranches with their fences strung tight and their cattle scattered thin across the sage, and she kept the iron box wrapped in her bedroll, close against her side, as though it might somehow lighten or vanish if she let her attention wander from it even for the space of a mile. She thought, more than once, of the rancher whose cattle had crossed that spring for years, of what he might say if he learned a girl of 17 intended to stand in a county office and tell a clerk that the water he had used without asking belonged, on paper her father had written and never filed, to her. She did not know his name yet. She knew only the fence line, the worn cattle paths cutting down toward the flat, the casual confidence of a man who had used a thing so long he had stopped imagining anyone would ever come to claim it out from under him. That too was a kind of arithmetic, she thought, use standing in for ownership, time standing in for a deed, and she wondered whether the law recognized the difference, or whether it simply recognized whoever arrived first with the proper paper in hand. The county seat announced itself before she reached it, a scatter of low buildings rising out of the flat distance, a church steeple, a row of storefronts with false wooden fronts, taller than the buildings behind them, smoke standing thin and straight above a scattering of chimneys in the cold afternoon air. She had $11 left of the 30 Constance had counted onto the table in Rimrock Junction, and she held that number in her mind now, the way she had once held elevation figures. Exact, unsentimental, a thing to be managed rather than mourned. She found the land office by the sign painted above its door, the paint chipped at the corners, the window glass filmed with dust that had settled there through some number of dry seasons she could not guess. Through the glass she could see shelves of ledgers running floor to ceiling, and a man seated behind a low counter, gray-headed, spectacled, bent over a document with the unhurried attention of someone who had spent a long life reading other people's claims to other people's land. She stood a moment on the boardwalk outside, the box heavy in her satchel, her father's compass in her pocket, and let herself feel, for just that one moment, the full weight of what she was about to ask a stranger to believe. The bell above the door made a small, tired sound when she pushed it open, and the gray-headed man looked up without hurry, the way a person looks up who has seen every kind of visitor a land office can produce, and long ago stopped expecting to be surprised. She said she had come about a parcel near Coldwater Flat, and watched his spectacles catch the window light as he set down his pen. He asked whose name the claim would fall under, and she told him her father's, Thomas, a licensed surveyor who had worked that country years before, and something in the old man's face shifted then, some private recalibration, as though a name had reached back through a long corridor of ledgers and touched a shelf he had not dusted in some while. He asked her to sit. He did not ask it unkindly. She set the satchel on the counter and drew out the notebook first, its cover soft and dark with age, and then the unsigned claim form, and then the letter, which she did not open in front of him, holding it instead against her knee, the way a person holds something they are not yet ready to let a stranger's eyes fall upon. The old man turned the notebook's pages slowly, his thumb pausing at the elevation sketches, at the chain measurement columns, written in a steady, patient hand, and he said, without looking up, that he remembered that hand. He said he had filed papers for that surveyor once, years back, before the flood, before the strike played out, and the town emptied itself onto the road west. He said the man had been careful. He said careful men were rarer in this trade than most people supposed. She told him the man had been her father. He looked at her then for a long moment, the way one looks at a photograph trying to locate a resemblance, and something in his face softened without becoming soft. The professional distance of a lifetime behind a counter still intact but no longer entirely unbroken. He asked to see the markers she believed still stood on the parcel, and she told him about the iron pin at the northeast corner, the blazed cottonwood along the wash, the stone cairn above the spring, described in the same unhurried, exact language her father had used in his own field notes, and she watched the old man's pen begin, almost without his deciding it, to move across a fresh page, as if her voice alone were enough to start the slow machinery of the county's memory, turning once more toward a claim that had waited 6 years in the dark, unmourned, unfiled, and entirely hers to finish. Mr. Pruitt worked through the winter afternoon with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years watching other men rush and regret it, cross-referencing her father's field notebook against the county's own surveys of the district, the ones filed by other men in other years who had mapped the land around Coldwater Flat without ever setting foot on the 70 acres themselves, content to leave a blank space on their charts where her father's careful notations should have been. He found no conflicting claim. He found no prior filing. He found, instead, a scattering of old correspondence in a drawer that had not been opened in some years. Letters from the Territorial Land Office asking whether the Coldwater Flat parcel had ever been finalized. Letters that had gone unanswered because the man who might have answered them was 6 years dead, and the daughter who might have answered them had been 30 miles away learning to count linens for a woman who kept better books than sentiment. He asked her to wait while he drafted the necessary forms, and she sat in the hard chair against the wall and watched dust turn slowly gold in the last of the afternoon light through the office's single window, and she thought of her father's hand, moving across a page in exactly the way this old man's hand now moved, unhurried, exact, each stroke earning the next. She thought that competence, wherever she found it, wore the same face regardless of the man wearing it, and that this was perhaps the truest thing her father had ever taught her without meaning to teach it at all. When Mr. Pruitt finished, he laid the papers before her and explained, in the flat, unornamented language of a man reciting procedure rather than delivering verdicts, what would be required: the formal application, the fee, a waiting period during which any competing claim might be lodged, a final inspection by a licensed surveyor to confirm the markers matched the notebook's description before the title could be recorded in her name. He said the inspection would ordinarily cost more than she likely had. He looked at her satchel, still resting against the chair leg, and did not ask what remained inside it, and she did not tell him, though she had already begun, in the private arithmetic she had learned to keep since the Tuesday morning in Rimrock Junction, to calculate how far $17.40 might be made to stretch against the weight of what she meant to hold on to. She asked him whether a claimant might conduct her own inspection if she held the same instruments and the same training as any licensed man, and he set down his pen and studied her again, longer this time, with the particular attention of someone recalculating a figure he had assumed settled. He did not answer at once. He rose instead, moved to the shelf where the county's licensing register lay, and turned its pages with the slow deliberateness of a man who had learned that speed rarely improved anything worth doing. He found what he was looking for, the statute allowing a claimant's own survey to stand, provided her instruments were sound and her methods verifiable by comparison to filed record, and he read it aloud to her twice, as though testing whether the words changed on a second hearing. They did not. He told her that in 11 years he had never once been asked to apply that clause, and that he saw no reason it should not apply now. She conducted the inspection herself on a morning in late January, with frost still silvering the sage and her breath standing visible ahead of her as she walked the boundary lines her father had walked 6 years before. She set the transit on the same limestone outcrop, sighted the same distant peak he had sighted, and read the same elevation off the same worn brass arc, and where his notebook said the northeast corner fell, she found the iron pin still standing, tilted but unmoved, exactly as he had left it. The claim was recorded in the county seat on the 3rd of February, 1880, under her own name, in the clerk's careful hand, 70 acres and a spring, no encumbrance, no dispute filed against it. She built slowly. A shed first, then a proper cabin, then a second room for storage of chain and rod, and the small tools of a trade that other men still assumed, on first meeting her, must belong to a husband or a brother who would presently appear. None appeared, and within 3 years the ranch's nearest cold-water flat had stopped waiting for one, sending instead for the surveyor who could read a boundary and price a water right without a wasted word. Whitlock came himself, eventually, hat in hand, paying in full for a survey he had once assumed he would never need. Years afterward, on a spring morning with the same white light lying flat across the flat, she stood a hired girl of perhaps 16 at the same limestone outcrop, showed her how to level the transit's bubble, how to sight the crosshair on a fixed point, and hold it there without breathing, and told her, in the unhurried voice of a man she still heard sometimes in her own, that patience was not a virtue so much as a method, and that the land would tell the truth to anyone willing to stand still long enough